Welcome everyone to today's NRLA webinar. As I'm sure you can see and may already be aware, in fact, it's about inventories, their importance and evidence in fitness to habitation. We're here with Richard Abbots, the founder and member, of course, of Inventory Hive. He's a qualified HHSRS assessor, that's the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, and he's also registered and qualified with NRLA Inventories. Hopefully Richard can hear me and he's here and it's all working well.
Yep, loud and clear.
Great stuff. So yeah, we're go ahead.
Marvellous. Thank you for the introduction, Dan. So Stacey, if you'd be so kind as to skip on to the next slide. Thank you very much. And obviously this one's just repeating the initial slide, but just by way of a very brief introduction, Inventory Hive, we're a cloud-based software platform and we're a preferred supplier for the NRLA. So hopefully the webinar today is informative, gives everybody the relevant backgrounds they need to know about the fitness for human habitation. And also coming up with some practical examples and scenarios. And towards the end of the webinar, we're also going to have a Q&A session as well. So hopefully, if anyone's got any burning questions in relation to inventories in general, or how the Fitness for Human Habitation or Homes Act is applied to inventories, or where the relevant touch points are, then hopefully they'll all be covered today, but you can also seek clarification. So without further ado, Stacey, if you'd be so kind as to go on to the next slide. So this just briefly outlines what we're going to cover during the webinar today. So initially, or the main body of the webinar is going to be all about the Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018. So specifically, we're going to look at the background about that. We're going to look at changes that came into play in 2019 and March 2020 this year. Also, around that as well, we'll specifically look at when a property is deemed unfit, when landlords aren't liable, look at a visual compliance framework, and also some practical examples, as I mentioned before, in relation to inventories. As I say, that will take up the main body of the webinar. We will then move on to how landlords and tenants can expect check-ins and check-outs to be different as a result of the the COVID pandemic. Also, how to prepare for an inventory post-COVID. And also looking at sort of market changes and innovations as well. And we will link that part specifically to government guidelines as well, which is obviously quite fluid at the moment, even with changes coming into play next Monday. Obviously it's a changing picture all the time. So hopefully we'll be able to cover lots of content that's interesting. So Stacey, if you would move on to the first slide, the next slide, please. So thank you. So the Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018. So as I said, obviously there's lots of guidance on this on the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, but what I'd like to do now is just highlight some of the key points and just give a brief overview. So landlords and agents have effectively been required to comply with legislation in relation to property standards and safety since the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985. However, this act did not ensure that these responsibilities were met through the whole length of the tenancy. While the Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018 featured no new legislation as such, it was introduced to build upon the existing responsibilities of landlords and agents, both private and social, and ensure that these are met throughout the tenancy. So, as you can see in this bulleted list here, when deciding if a property is fit for human habitation, there are a number of factors to consider. As you can see in that bulleted list there, repairs, condition of the building, freedom from damp, ventilation, suitable facilities, water supply, etc. So, and then the final point in there as well is any prescribed hazard of category 1 or 2 defined under the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. Now, just to make an important distinction there, the Housing Health and Safety Rating System is based upon vulnerable age groups generically, whereas the Fitness for Human Habitation is specific to the tenants themselves. So the government, as I say, has produced a number of guides on that, but that hopefully just gives a brief bit of background into the Act itself. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Stacey. Changes that came into play in 2019 and 2020. So, I mean, obviously, as a result of the coronavirus outbreak, I suppose that if nothing else, it's kind of highlighted people, maybe being furloughed or spending more time in their houses, having a suitable place, to live is naturally a priority for everybody. But for landlords and managing agents, it's important that they can provide that space for their tenants. And since the Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018 went live in March 2019, there have been a number of misconceptions surrounding best practice in regard to staying compliant as an agent. Then with the current pandemic, it's understandable as well how March 2020, when lockdown started, some of this has perhaps not been as well publicised or has maybe gone under the radar a little bit. So really important to consider that that from the 20th of March 2020, the Act started to apply to all periodic tenancies, as well as tenancies that started before the 20th of March 2019. So now perhaps is the time to ensure that you are compliant as a landlord and check that your practices and properties are up to the required standards. If you can move on to the next one, please, Stacey. So when a property is unfit for habitation, so even if a property fails one or more of the factors bulleted in one of the first slides a moment ago, where we looked at that unfit list, that does not mean that it's deemed unfit for human habitation. According to the legislation, properties can only be deemed unfit if it is so far defective in one or more of those matters that it is not reasonably suitable for occupation in that condition. So once a property is deemed unfit, tenants have the right to take court action for a breach of contract. However, a landlord's liability to fix any issues does not arise until the landlord has received a notice of unfitness and has the ample time to remedy it. So that's a really key part of the process here. This can be given by the tenant or third party. If the issue is related to a common part or exterior of the building, the landlord is deemed liable as soon as this occurs. So, in complex cases, expert evidence may be sought to establish unfitness and the landlord's liability. This could be a report from a surveyor or a member of the environmental health. When cases are more straightforward, the testimony from the tenant can be enough. If a court rules in the favour of the tenant and agrees that the property was or isn't fit for habitation, the landlord may be able to pay compensation or do the necessary works to improve the property. So that's looking at when a property is unfit for habitation. So I suppose conversely, on the next slide, Stacey, if you would. When landlords aren't liable. So it is worth noting that tenants also have a responsibility to ensure that the property remains suitable for human habitation, and that there are some cases where the tenant can cause unfitness themselves. The landlord is not liable for remedying issues, for instance, in situations where the unfitness has been caused by their failure to use the property in the appropriate manner, or where the tenant has breached the tenancy agreement. For example, tenants not allowing repair access, in order for repairs to be carried out. There's perhaps a good specific example. The landlord is not liable if works cannot be carried out due to being denied consent from a third party, or when works or repairs cause the landlord to breach other legal obligations, such as breaching planning permission. That has long since been an issue with the housing health and safety rating system for sure. When damage has been caused by an accident such as fire, flood, or a storm, the landlord is not liable either. So hopefully that is a good introduction to the background and scenarios surrounding fitness for human habitation. But most specifically, and obviously what this webinar is all about, is having a look at landlord responsibilities. So on the next slide, we have a compliance framework document. So special thanks to our partners over at Fixflow, these who provide maintenance software. They had this document produced back in August 2018 with Dutton Gregory solicitors. So I think it's a really nice, simple visual way to understand throughout the life cycle of a tenancy, pre-tenancy, during and after, as to what steps landlords should have in place. Because of course, a lot of this is also about evidencing what the property was like before, during and after, and obviously there are responsibilities throughout that journey. So as you can see on the left-hand side of this framework document, it is good practice to carry out an in-depth inventory of the property with images and comments before the tenancy commences. in order to have a record of the condition throughout. If this is carried out by a landlord agent or perhaps using a third-party clerk, it is likely to be enough evidence to satisfy fitness for human habitation compliance. So what I think it's important to note that, because as I'm going to come on to some examples in just a moment, I've seen reports that have 29 checklist questions relating to the housing health and safety rating system, which has 29 hazards. So that's where the 29 questions come from. However, it's really important to note that when producing an inventory, whether you're doing it personally or whether you're using a third-party clerk, they should have, or you should, or that clerk should have a disclaimer within the back of their report to say that they are not a surveyor surveying the property. They are doing a visual report about the superficial condition and cleanliness, and therefore, to think that you could cover off compliance of asbestos and biocides, for instance, which are the 5th and 6th compliance points in relation to housing health and safety. That's not really possible to do that with a simple yes or no question. So what I don't want this webinar to be about is any scaremongering. If you have a good, robust inventory process in place, with well-documented condition and cleanliness, then that should suffice. As I say, I will give some specific examples of that in just a moment as well. So, Inventory Hive is a software platform. We always give our users a generic template that covers off those disclaimers, and also gives some descriptions out the gate or off the shelf on, for instance, ceilings is a good example. So if you were to say that before the tenant went into the property, the ceiling was free of marks and mold. Now that obviously demonstrates that there wasn't any mold present before the tenant went into the property. If also you were able to demonstrate that there was in the inventory that there was a working extractor fan, that maybe there was keys for the windows so that the adequate ventilation could be put in place, then if mold occurs due to tenant behavior, then of course you're covering yourself off with an inventory. So there's some really simple things, or steps that you can do, which, as I say, can sometimes be overlooked. So let's have a look and move on to, actually, yes, Stacey, if you mind just at this point, just moving on to the next slide. So, just to kind of, go elaborate on those points before we go back to the framework in just a second. Here is just a simple example of a disclaimer, a standard disclaimer to say that this report has been prepared by an inspector who is not an expert in buildings, furnishings, decorations, woods, antiques, or a qualified surveyor. Now, it could be that that person is, but for the purposes of an inventory, as I say, this is a basic visual report about the superficial condition and cleanliness. Now, as I said before, yes, it's not prevalent to have 29 checklist questions covering off all the points in the housing health and safety rating system, because it's overkill and it would be a waste of time. There are the benefits of having some habitation compliance checklist questions within your report, but they should be specific to basic visual checks that you can do, or information that you have readily have access to. So, and here's a few, on the right hand side of the screen here, you can see I've boxed that one off in the top right corner, where all entrances, exits and windows have secure locking mechanisms in working order with the appropriate keys, access cards and or codes supplied to the tenant. Now, that covers off the 12th housing health and safety rating system point, which is about entry by intruders. So very simple yes or no question that you can quite objectively answer with a yes and no, whereas, as I say, some of the other points could be a little bit cryptic if you went down the route of having a yes and no. So just bear that in mind, that you don't need to have gone lots of training courses to be able to create a good inventory, but you should consider some of these points when you're putting that together. Okay, so if you could just pop back to the previous slide for me, Stacey. So, okay, so we've looked at the start of the tenancy there. So the during bit is important, as you can see in this framework here. So there's a few points to note during a tenancy to demonstrate FFHH compliance. So you need to have a good maintenance reporting process in place. I'm not going to cover that too much during this webinar because it's not necessarily on point, but it is, as you can see in this framework, very important to have a process in place that enables tenants to report issues and enables you to respond accordingly. Also, conducting routine inspections at the property. Now, of course, because of coronavirus, that's been difficult to do so. As a platform, we introduced the ability for landlords to do that remotely by giving tenants an electronic form where they could add comments and take photos of issues, but do it remotely via a simple web page from their phone. So whilst this framework was produced before COVID broke in March this year, there are measures that you can put in place. And actually, the government guidance, although it's evolving all the time, has specifically referred to the use of technology, to enable you to do that. So just to sort of reiterate that, it is important that landlords schedule regular interim inspections throughout the tenancy to ensure the property remains in good condition. Those reports serve as, obviously a good reference point for any issues which may arise during the tenancy and create a trail for audit purposes. Interim reports also help to ensure landlords remain compliant over time, and of course help to identify any breaches in the tenancy agreement. Now, of course, that is a really important point, because as we referred to a moment ago in the webinar, if the property is not considered to be fit for human habitation as a result of tenant behaviour, the only way that perhaps you would identify that when the tenant is in situ is by doing regular inspections. So obviously that side of it is important. So let's have a quick look. So so the next bit then is responsibilities post tenancy. Okay, so similarly, should I say, to the inventory and interim reports, it is vitally important that landlords and agents carry out a final visit and a checkout report. That report again needs to feature really clear visuals with detailed descriptions of the condition of the property. Often, of course, the checkout report is compared against the inventory to identify any damages or wear and tear that's occurred. A copy of that inventory should be taken to the checkout visit to ensure that the items are commented upon. In some cases, there are little changes in condition and there won't be any serious fitness for human habitation concerns to mention. It is unnecessary to make comments on the same items, fixtures and fittings. To make the process more efficient, Inventory Hive, we allow that to happen, before and after. It's all about having that audit trail and being able to demonstrate that. So let's have a quick look. So if you could move on to the next slide for me, please, Stacey. And the next one again, if you would. So obviously we've covered off the main points, in regards to fitness for human habitation, but obviously relevantly to this topic as well is COVID-19 inventories and checkouts. Now, as you can understand, we've kept a really close eye on the government advice. So the most prevalent document at the moment, and the points that are covered off in there, is the government advice on home moving during the outbreak. So specifically, some of the points they put in there is that letting agents, or landlords in this case, may also want to consider obtaining consent for an inventory clerk appointment. So if you are outsourcing your appointments, it's really important to consider that you are communicating with your tenants to ensure that you've got permission, and also, of course, being able to identify that there aren't any health issues surrounding that. Letting agents and landlords should take steps to ensure any properties are prepared, ready for new tenants. This can include cleaning to minimise any potential spread of the virus, which I mean is pretty much common sense stuff, but it is explicitly referred to in the guidance. And also as well about tenancy check-ins. Now, tenancy check-ins are, or perhaps historically, have been the favoured approach when the tenant is moving in. So in other words, the inventory is performed, the tenants met at the property physically, to hand over the keys and do a walk around the property. Now, Stacey, if you could go on to the next slide for me. I think, and this leads nicely into, market changes and innovations. Inventory Hive, we've long since advocated really that, an attended check-in is perhaps not only is it not efficient often to do that, because it often involves 2 visits to the property, one to create an inventory, because that can be a little bit time consuming, and one to actually physically meet the tenant there on the day. Now, that latter part of meeting them there on the day, of course, in the COVID times that we're in at the moment, there's a risk involved there. And obviously all of this, process and a lot of the, pressures on landlords these days is all about, mitigating risk, making sure that you're compliant. Now, physically meeting a tenant at a property at the moment to do an attended check-in isn't perhaps the best use of your time. And also actually, inexperience can lead to disputes sometimes as well. So for example, if you're expecting a tenant or tenants to physically sign an inventory on the day they move in, if you think about this, I suppose, from a tenant's perspective, if they've got their removal van waiting outside with all their possessions in the van, the last thing that they want to do is go around looking at skirting boards and the ceiling and marks on the wall. Let's face it, they will sign pretty much anything because they just want to get moved in. Now, of course, there is also the issue that if you do an attended check-in, you know yourself, when you've been in a property for maybe a week or two, or even a few days, you notice issues that you wouldn't necessarily pick up unless you've lived in the property. So that could be, the shower screen hinges loose, or, the cupboard door, falls ajar when you open it. Those kind of issues that you wouldn't necessarily pick up when doing an attended check-in. And therefore, as a platform, what we wanted to do was always give tenants, a way in which they can interact and feedback. So I don't want this to be, this part to become, salesy on Inventory Hive's part, but it is very relevant to the COVID period at the moment. So, consider having, some form of digital process that allows these things to happen remotely, whether it's capturing their signature remotely or having them provide feedback. That's something as a platform that we cover. Which basically means that tenants confirm receipt of their report via an email and signing it on their phone before they move in, which means that you can then safely give them the keys remotely. Is perhaps the better way of doing this. I mean, we know that there's lots of landlords that have always used key safes, and had them with a combination code outside the property. Once they've got their tenant, once their tenant's confirmed receipt of their report, that then means they're covered, because there's never a time they don't have a completed report. If the tenant's given the combination to get into the property, or given the keys then remotely to go and move in of their own accord, then there's a few things happen. Obviously, they can forget to look at their inventory, in which case they get reminded by our platform, or if they want to have some feedback. Now, I think the feedback part is very, very important. More often than not, disputes arise with deposits when a tenant hasn't been encouraged to actively engage with their inventory at the start of their tenancy. Often tenants only bother really looking at it when they're doing it, when they're moving out, and of course that's too late. You want them to look at it, you want them to pick up issues, you want them to add detail and say, well, actually there's a stain on the carpet and you missed it off the report, and it does happen. Obviously we're only human. You really want to engage with them and get them to do that at the start of the tenancy. And by giving them a simple and efficient way of doing that, you can obviously avoid unnecessary disputes. I came across some statistics from TDS recently that said, I think it's something like 1.5% of tenancy deposits end up in an adjudication dispute, which is a really low figure. But more interestingly, up to 43% of all deposits, these are based on TDS statistics, up to 43% of those ended up with some form of deposit deduction, which is obviously a significantly high number. Now, obviously, it's not possible to demonstrate fitness for human habitation comfortably throughout the cycle of a tenancy, before, during, and after, as is avoiding disputes. It's not possible to do that unless you've got an inventory. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Stacey. So as as part of the sort of the pre-communication on this webinar, inventories, interim visits and checkouts, have definitely evolved into a compliance evidencing necessity. They're no longer used simply to demonstrate condition and cleanliness. It's very much, instances like smoke alarms, proving that they were working upon the day of check-in, those kind of things are all covered off within an inventory report. So it is becoming, more of an important document over time. So that concludes everything that I had on my side to deliver content-wise. I just wanted to very quickly mention a couple of things. So thanks to Fixflow for that compliance document. That framework document, I think it's really useful, a nice simple visual, and also to TDS for their informative guides along the way. If anybody has any questions of Inventory Hive as a platform, obviously you can just go onto the website there and scroll to the bottom and send an inquiry, or there's a chat facility on the bottom right corner if anybody wants to engage with us. And there is a trial on the platform as well for any landlords that want to have a play without committing. So Dan, I believe you might have some questions that have been submitted.
Yeah, we should have some here. We'll just get the list of some of them that had. So the first one we'd had, it was from one of our members. They only have two properties. I mean, it may have already been answered, but they're asking if the inventories have to be done by a third party and does it have to have photo evidence? Sometimes it can prove to be expensive.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and obviously we on our platform we have landlords, we have inventory clerks, and I think the answer to that question is um, there has never been a time where a dispute has not gone successfully in the favour of a landlord because the report was conducted by them or by a third party.
Mm,
Evidencing of disputes and who's successful or how successful the outcome is for the landlord is purely based on whether or not the evidence was good enough or not. Now,
yeah.
therefore, by default, I suppose inventory clerks that do this for a living, that are qualified and they're experienced at doing it, would suggest that paying for their results is probably a worthwhile exercise because obviously that's what they do for a living. So if they're a good inventory clerk and they're worth their salt, then they're going to cover off the condition and the cleanliness really well. I think DIY reports being produced by landlords, unless they have some kind of templated guidance, which is obviously something we as a platform try to give them off the shelf. Often the tendency can be to say things like, for example, the door, it's a wooden door with a handle. Now,
Mm,
obviously, most doors have handles, and most doors are made of wood,
yeah,
and therefore
quite
that's
often.
yeah, that's pretty useless when it comes to a dispute. Whereas an inventory clerk that's experienced, or someone with maybe a templated report, will say something along the lines that the door's free of scratches, front, side, and reverse, the hinge is intact and working. Because those are the issues that are going to more likely become disputes at the end of the tenancy. So it's about having clear written descriptions. So I suppose that the short answer to that question is it doesn't matter who produces the report as long as it's good enough. Now, you're
Yeah.
right, sometimes it can be costly to have a clerk do it, but I suppose not as half as costly as it would be if you had a dispute at the end of the tenancy that was significant. That £100, £150, depending on where you're based. Obviously, London prices, can be a bit more costly. That's perhaps a fee that you're willing to pay, but equally, you can create reports, on a platform like ours and do it yourself. But
Mm.
how much do you value your time? Can you put a price on that? Is what I would
Yeah,
say is.
yeah, it's tricky, but I do sort of agree. I think that the value of having it done professionally by someone that knows sort of the ins and outs and exactly what they're looking for is probably worth it. I mean, we've had sort of queries to the advice line where I did the inventory, I went around everything, I took all day doing it, but actually the damage was to the inside of the kitchen cupboard and only took pictures of the outside of the kitchen. Things like that, little things that
Yeah,
you might miss doing it yourself.
and again, those points that you make there, Dan. When we create a template, we will say things like, with kitchen cupboards and fridges, free of items inside, and possession. So, and this is where I think the tendency sometimes with inventories can be to take a million photos or
Mm,
produce a video. I mean, a video is an entirely different question, but having the written word can
mm,
often negate the need to take unnecessary photos. So a good example is like plug sockets. You could say something like, free of marks and scratches and intact. There's
mm,
four present. That if you say that they're intact and that's worded appropriately, and you've given your tenants a fair way in which to feedback and engage, then you don't necessarily need to go around and take 4 close-up photos of those plug sockets. Um, you know, that's where you can have general overview photos of a room. Now, general overview photos of a room would show them intact.
that's
So
yeah.
excuse the dog barking in the background. I am actually in the
No, it's
office,
okay. Oh,
and
okay.
we have an
Interesting.
office dog, and it's downstairs, so
Oh,
it's barking
okay.
away.
Fair enough. I'll just quickly mention, just before we ask any other questions, we've had a couple of questions in about if they'll get a recording for this webinar. It should be in about an hour's time after it's finished. So this is basically this afternoon, you should receive the recording, anyone that signed up. So just to answer those questions just there and then. Um, I mean, we did touch on it then as we were talking. Actually, we've had a few questions that sort of do ask about video inventories. And
Yes.
like we said there, the written word can help. And, the one I always like to bring up when we talk about writing is if a room has a smell or doesn't have a smell and then smoke damage, you can't really take a photo or a video of a smell. We have no way to
Yes.
capture that other than the written word. But is there anything that you would bring up on the topic of video inventories? Is there anything to be aware of? Are they good, bad, or?
Yeah, and I think it's one of the. I suppose on the surface you might think, oh, a video would be great, but I think
Mm,
there's a few reasons why you need to be very careful with video inventories. Is that photographs and videos are useful, absolutely, but they're not a substitute for the written word. Photographs and videos fail to show some defects, as you just said, like dust.
mm,
However, you know and often as well, they're not always that useful in the event of a dispute. So a really good example is obviously with the written word, if you give a written report to a tenant, they could quite easily respond to agreeing or disagreeing at the point of moving. They could say, for example, let's just say it's referring to a carpet, a floor, saying that there's no stains on the carpet. The tenant could quite easily email back, or on a platform like ours, communicate through the platform and say, actually, there's a large stain in the corner of the carpet, and supply a photograph. That
mm.
is therefore very objective. Both parties agree, it's clearly documented. Now, if it's done via a video, it's very difficult for the tenant to sort of comment on that. They're going to have to sit and watch through
What?
you know
Yeah.
a 20-minute, half an hour, or heaven forbid, I've seen video inventories that are an hour long. Apart from the fact for the tenant, that's like watching grass grow. Just as it would be for an adjudicator. It's very difficult for the tenant to then. That tenant would have to say, "Oh, on 20 minutes and 30 seconds, you refer to the floor, and actually, I think it's this." You end up then responding in writing to what they've said, and then you've got a mix of a video plus an a trail of emails that have gone backwards and forwards. And then, of course, if you're doing a checkout and you're comparing it to the check-in video, you've then got to match the timings up, and that's why adjudicators, I would imagine, groan with in desperation
Yeah.
when they receive a video inventory for that reason. You have to
Okay.
think practically, how an adjudicator, I suppose, would view that. I'm not saying that there
Mhm.
isn't a value in videos in certain instances. Like a good example might be, if you're trying to show a mechanism that's not working, a video might be useful in that scenario. But typically there's never a substitute, for the written word, because obviously, it allows that communication, which is very clear, and hopefully, if it's documented and audit trailed in the right way, it's more useful.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. I've not actually thought of it in that way about having to actually compare the start and end one. So I suppose that's a reason against it. But like you say, there might be a time where you'd want to use one.
Yes,
Um,
yeah,
we have another question here. Um, they had an issue whether the inventory clerk had changed the report. So in their
yeah.
words, they signed a checkout report online, then found the next day that the clerk had changed the condition of the mattress that was left in the garage by the tenant. In the original
Mhm.
report, it was noted the tenant had left a soiled mattress in the garage that would be collected later on. And then the tenant has contacted the clerk and it's been changed to a new one worth £800. They've then spoke to the clerk and then they said they've changed it because the tenant had informed them. Would that perhaps just be an issue with that service or their software, or is that something you've heard of before?
Yeah, I suppose there's a few points on there.
Mhm.
Obviously I can't comment on other platforms. What
Of
we do as a
course, yeah.
platform is, we lock down that PDF report so that we clearly audit trail everything that's been said by whom and when. Now, also, we don't allow tenants to just add a comment and say, oh, it was new, or there's a stain or a mark. They have to supply a photo with it as evidence.
Right.
So if there was a photo, obviously, if that inventory clerk had done a report and taken a photo of that mattress and had originally deemed that it was heavily soiled, you'd like to think that there's an accompanying photo that's tagged to that description,
Mm.
which then means if the tenant were to then go back and say, well, actually, it's a brand new mattress and it's £800, if that's happening in check-in, they would have to provide a photo. If it's checkout, they can just provide comments. But really, the clerk shouldn't be going in and amending their initial description, because surely if they've it should be very black and white. If I'm in a
Yeah.
property and I'm looking at the condition of a mattress, if it's soiled, it's soiled. That my position on that's not going to change if the tenant comes back and makes a comment.
Mm.
So my thought on that would be, if that report had somehow been redrafted, then there should be an audit trail of what had been said and when. And if there isn't, then obviously that process is flawed somewhat.
Right. So yeah, it might be a case that they think about getting a different inventory clerk next time that though it doesn't have that issue.
Yeah,
Um,
communicating with them as well, and but yeah, it
yeah.
certainly seems a strange one that
Mm,
that it would be adapted, because clerk, the whole point of an inventory clerk is that they're impartial, they tell it how it is, it's very objective, and that they're not, that they're not swayed by the tenant or by the landlord for that matter. Their position should be impartial, and that's where the value of a clerk can come in.
mm,
But again, it comes down to providing you've given tenants a fair way to engage and feedback throughout the process, then you should always be covered, whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're outsourcing.
okay. We've had another question that was as follows. In a flat share, if one tenant leaves and is replaced by another tenant, what can they do to ensure that the remaining tenants, or the incoming tenant as well, have all sort of adopted that inventory from the start of that original tenancy? So that they're
Yeah,
all basically agreeing to it, if that makes sense.
yeah, it's an interesting one. Strictly speaking, that I suppose the best approach, you know, is to bring the tenancy to an end.
Mm,
Check out the named tenants and distribute the deposit. But obviously, that approach is it's not realistically achievable or practical.
mm,
So there is a process that you could follow. Now, there's a process there in relation to the inventory itself, and there's also a process there in relation to the tenancy agreement. Um,
mm,
so there are some specific guides on this. That the TDS provide. There is actually a PDF guide that actually breaks this down. Now, I won't go through all
yeah.
that now because there are sort of 10 steps that you might want to follow in
Hmm.
order to address that issue. But it is relatively common. Ultimately, as far as the inventory is concerned, you would need to ensure that the room, say for instance, it was a tenant going into an apartment and they were maybe responsible for bedroom number one, but also
Hmm.
they're by default responsible for the communal areas. You would want to ensure that they're signing an updated inventory for their room and space,
Yeah.
because you need to be able to evidence what it was like when they were going in, and also to get a view on what those communal spaces were, what the position is. Does that tenant also have responsibility by default for the check-in inventory with the rest of the tenants? That stuff would need to be agreed, and you would need to have a documented report. That's the inventory side of it. Obviously, the best people to guide in relation to the actual tenancy itself, or the deposit, would be the TDS and their guide. So
Hmm.
um, I believe in the post copy email that goes out, our email address will be in there as well. So we will gladly send you the link for that guide as well, if anybody's
Yeah.
interested in obtaining that.
Yeah, and the slides as well will go out on the email, I believe. That we've had a
Yeah,
question or two that asked about that.
yeah.
Let me just pull up another question here. 1 second. So this is a sort of interesting one. So I'll try to summarize it. Due to COVID, essentially, a lot more people are going to be working at home, and
Mhm.
that, in a sense, the landlord's residential space they provided is almost become like an office space. Not literally, it's not going to be full of 20 people, but there'll be more wear and tear than you might expect. Chairs and desks and so on. Is that something that might impact on the inventory or the check-in? There might have been more damage or wear and tear than you might have expected when you come to check out at the end.
Yeah, again, I would imagine that, you know, uh, first and foremost is, the inventory should be very objective. What was it like before? What was it like afterwards? In terms of wear and
Mm.
tear, again, TDS, for instance, have a PDF guide specifically on the lifespan of items and what you would expect to see.
Yeah,
Now,
they
obviously,
do. Yeah.
where it comes to wear and tear, with wear and tear, it's also prevalent to consider that it's based upon the number of occupants and also the usage. So you're absolutely right. If somebody's using, an office space more, or there's more traffic in an area, you would expect there to be a higher level of wear and tear in that area. So yes, that would more likely be considered, in the event of a dispute. But it's also worth considering, that it's not new for old. There will be depreciation, involved in that calculation. So I would probably suggest as well having a look at that, that TDS guide, which again I'll be, happy to provide the
Hmm.
links for after the webinar, so that they can see, those lifespan guides.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's sort of loosely related to inventories. I've got a question about sort of how can you actually practically make the tenants keep the house clean? I suppose it's almost delving into a bit of what we would do on the advice line. They've put
Yeah.
up the rota
Mhm.
and they've sort of said, this is your week to clean, this is the next tenant's week to clean, but obviously one person doesn't clean and then it all sort of falls apart. Is there any sort of
Yeah.
guidance we'd have on that kind of matter?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, when you consider when you consider the cleaning side of it, again, within your inventory, you really need to be considering the what was agreed at the start. What's in the tenancy agreement. You need to be able to identify in the inventory, of course, if it was professionally cleaned prior to them going in. So what would you need to supply in order to evidence that? You would need to evidence receipts, perhaps, that it had been professionally cleaned. And if you have that outlined within your inventory, and you also have a deposit use clause within your tenancy agreement. So, for example, it might be that you agree as part of the tenancy agreement that the property will be professionally cleaned before, and that the tenant will agree to have it professionally cleaned. The tenants will have it professionally cleaned when they move out. Now, obviously, what they're doing while they're in situ, perhaps the incentive there is to have it clearly communicated that it was agreed at the start of the tenancy that the property would be professionally cleaned, and that as part of it, them exiting the property, that it would be professionally cleaned again. Now, whether they were to pay for that, sometimes that could be enough of an incentive, but it's a difficult question, isn't it?
I
Because
would say with the Tenant Fees Act, I wouldn't really want to put a fee on top of that, but you could definitely say it's been cleaned beforehand, and then when you leave, it should be provided back in the same standard. And then if it's not, you can deduct from the deposit and pay your own costs of getting it cleaned. That would be how I would approach it personally.
Absolutely, yeah, no, that's good advice, Dan. And I think what I suppose what it boils down to is, isn't it? You can't really, you can try and incentivize and encourage tenant behaviour, but you can't make them, clean it.
Yeah, sure.
You
Yeah,
can
you
just
can never force them.
no, you can put measures in place. Is the reality. Obviously we don't necessarily live in an ideal world, and but incentivizing them is a good way to go during the tenancy, for sure.
Yeah, we've had one comment as well on that sort of topic. They find it that this it's not showing the name, unfortunately. It's very small. They have a cleaner to just go in and work on the communal spaces in their HMO. It
Yes.
also allows someone to go in and actually see the property and have a look and say, oh, yeah, it's in a good state. They're keeping it clean. Obviously,
Yeah.
as well as actually going in to clean, and that's something you can do. And you couldn't charge a fee for it, but you could cover your own costs through the rent.
Yeah.
So that's another common way of approaching that.
It is, isn't it? So I suppose you could then say that the expectations of the residents in the communal areas are basics.
Mm.
So even if it's a case of putting things away, and doing some bare minimum stuff, and then a cleaner goes in and maybe does the deeper stuff. Whether it's wiping surfaces down and that kind of thing. So it's kind of meeting them halfway again, isn't it? There, but like you say, covering your cost, in the most efficient way.
We've got another question about repair work. Repairs identified during a routine inspection, they're down to the tenants to put them right. Would the landlord be in their right to ask the tenant to do so? I mean, I would personally say that yes. The majority of repairs do fall down to the landlord, though, so it may not be most of the time in that case.
Again,
Should there be?
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Dan, again, so I suppose it comes down to, how that repair issue has occurred and what it relates to.
Mm,
If it's
mm,
because, and HMO examples are common ones these days, aren't they? So if
yeah.
there's been a party and someone's someone's damaged something and they hold their hands up, then of course that would be their responsibility. But
Mm.
if it's relating to sort of heating or ventilation, then that that typically falls with the landlord.
Yeah, most repair work is generally going to be. There's certain things like you wouldn't expect landlords to be going and fixing light bulbs and things like that. The tenants can change a light bulb. Maybe they
Yes.
can't, but it should be them that can.
Yeah.
Uh, Obviously, should there be a time given for the work to be completed? That's interesting. Would a further inspection be scheduled to sort of check on the work? I suppose that could be like, would you need further evidence to do with your inventory in that sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and obviously, I suppose in the the COVID world we're in at the moment, some of these issues might be communicated remotely. If they've damaged something, they're unlikely to come forward, um, and say, this was caused. Often those things are only picked up during checkout, in which case they might then put their hands up and say it. And this is where you have permissive waste issues are a concern with coronavirus, because landlords aren't always able to gain access to the property in order to go and visually inspect it. I mean, that's why as a platform we came up with a way of doing it remotely. So you are still getting them to sign off and confirm at regular intervals that everything inside the property is as it should be, because then when they move out, if there's lots of issues that aren't in there, at least you can prove you've given them the opportunity to raise them. And therefore it's not because you're being negligent as a landlord and you're not listening to those issues. Obviously, as we alluded to at the start of the webinar in relation to fitness for human habitation, it's only deemed to be the landlord's responsibility once you've had that communication, once you've been told that it's unfit. Obviously that is all down to that information being forthcoming in the first place.
We've had a question here, one during the webinar. After an inventory checkout, the clerk contacted the landlord and told them the inventory file had been accidentally destroyed. By this time, decorators already been in to restore the damage, so they essentially had no evidence. What would be kind of the responsibility there? Is it the agency not finding? I believe they have a managing agent. So the agent who found the inventory clerk, or would it be the clerk's fault? Would it just be, depends how it got damaged, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because you are at the mercy of actually having the physical evidence. So you would like to think that whether it's an agent or a clerk actually creating these reports, that they have some kind of backup process. So again, as a landlord, if you are using a third party, whether it be an agent, whether it be an inventory clerk, it is recommended that you always have copies of these documents yourself and backing, just for your own sanity, your own backup purposes. I suppose that is just an unfortunate circumstance. If they've lost the report, then obviously I suppose the buck stops with them, really, doesn't it? And that is probably quite an unusual scenario. But as I say, it does raise the point that it is worth obviously having backups of such documents. Just for your own sanity. Yes, you might be outsourcing it, but there's no reason you can't have access to all the files, certificates, reports relating to that property on record yourself, even if you are one that outsources to an agent or to a clerk and so on.
Yeah, certainly. Let me have a look here. There's a question here about the remote testing and ensuring smoke alarms or carbon monoxide alarms are tested on the day of the check-in, sort of in front of the tenant's presence. Is there a way that sort of is incorporated?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because that is very clear within the legislation that you need to be able to evidence at the start of the tenancy that was in play. And now, as a platform, we have a specific clause within our declaration. When the tenant is signing the report off digitally, they also sign to confirm that the smoke alarm was tested and working on the day of check-in. So that they too physically tested it, and that is signed off. We make sure we put that in with all of our reports. Of course, we also have like document serving in there as well, so they can ensure that they demonstrate that the gas safety certificates, the how to rent guide was supplied pre-move in, because they have to sign and confirm receipt of their report before they move in. So we use that opportunity as well to cover off that side of the compliance. But I would say in a declaration of any kind of inventory or check-in, the tenant should be specifically signing to say that they have tested that alarm and that it's audible, that the alarm is working. I think that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. There's a question here: if a stairwell didn't have natural light, or I suppose there could mean enough natural light, would that fail on the habitable status? I suppose we could just talk about generally what habitable would mean in that sense.
Yeah, so in that scenario, the actual housing health and safety rating system does refer to natural lighting, but within that, it also refers to artificial lighting as well. That's the 13th point in the housing health and safety rating system. So I'd recommend having a look at that. Obviously, on the strength of a question alone, I wouldn't be able to answer that question. However, if you look at the guidelines, it bases it upon the most vulnerable age groups. So obviously, lighting in that respect, can relate to mental health. It could also relate to obviously trips and falls as well, because the level. The two can be interlinked with one another, but not necessarily if there is adequate artificial lighting.
Yeah, And trips and falls on stairs is its own separate hazard, isn't it? So
It
and
is,
falls
yeah.
between levels as well.
That's right. Yeah. So
Um,
there's a couple on there. Falls associated with stairs and ramps, and then falls between levels.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot that could come in here. You know, you might have a stairwell that if you don't want to fall down any stairwell, but if you fell down, it might not be the worst. There are also you could fall down a very steep set of stairs, and there might be a glass door, and those sorts of
Yes.
things will play in. The
Exactly. Yeah.
stairwell having natural light failing habitable status on its own. In terms of fitness for human habitation, it's to be unfit for. Well, HHSRS is unfit for the vulnerable group, and FFHH is unfit for that tenant.
Yes.
So if that tenant would, it would be unfit for that person to live in there because they can't see to get up the stairs, and you would have to address that.
Yeah.
Would it completely fail? Would they have a successful claim? That's a bit too vague of a question just from that question, but
It
yeah.
is, yeah. They're all done on a case by case basis, and as you
Mm,
rightly say, whether they deem it to be a category one or category two, one being more severe, is based upon all those variables that you've just mentioned there, Dan.
mhm, mhm. Um, there is a question about will a standard inventory insurance cover a fitness unit habitation inspection as part of an inventory? So I think there's been a couple of questions about having an inventory and a fitness unit habitation sort of assessment all in one. Is that a service that's out there? Is that possible? Or
Yeah, as I said before, I mean, strictly speaking, providing the inventory
mm,
has a good balance of photos
good
and written
claim?
descriptions. Written descriptions, yeah, it should be more than adequate.
Mm-hmm,
As I said before, there's no harm in having some fitness for human habitation checklist questions, but
hmm.
they are only simple visual yes and no questions, and they cannot address issues that sit under housing health and safety rating system,
Yeah.
and whether or not you're liable. Like, there could be asbestos in the property that you are unaware of.
Mm,
You're not going to be able to answer those questions with a yes and no. And strictly speaking, an inventory is done by somebody who's not a building surveyor. Um,
yeah.
you know, and that is a really important distinction to make. So whilst you want the inventory, I think the most important thing I would say is to make sure that the inventory covers off things like ventilation in rooms,
Mm,
key, if there's locks on windows, was there keys there,
mm,
did you give them sufficient locking mechanisms for the front door, the back door, are there any all of those things can be covered off with a really simple description in an inventory, like
mhm,
the ceiling not having mold, the extractor fan working on the cooker or in the bathroom. They are very basic things, but actually often can be overlooked on an inventory. So I don't think you don't need a specific fitness for human habitation report to be conducted. You just need a good solid inventory, perhaps with some compliance checklist questions,
yeah.
of which obviously we cover those on the platform for people using us.
Mm. So if someone really wanted those fitness unit habitation and those hazards addressing, you'd probably go and get something else separately, and an inventory would be the best idea then. You would
So
get.
yeah, what I would say is have a check, some fitness for human habitation checklist questions within
Mhm,
your inventory,
yeah.
so that you are getting the tenant to sign it off within that report. If you
Mhm,
have concerns about issues, then obviously it would be the right thing to do to investigate them or have a surveyor come in.
mhm,
And check some of those issues out. And that could be, as you've said, it could be to do with artificial lighting. It could be to do with excess cold or preparing food on surfaces. But again, food on surfaces is a good example. Providing your inventory clearly shows that those work surfaces were clean, they were accessible. You're really ticking that box, and you don't necessarily need a fitness for human habitation report. And I think it's important to note that, because I have seen a little bit of scaremongering out there where it's landlords feel, oh, I've got to pay an extra £100 to have an inventory and to have that done.
yeah.
So obviously just beware of that. I mean, I've not seen any clerks out there trying to exploit that, but I have seen articles in the media that maybe
Mm.
exacerbate it, or use a bit of scaremongering, and so I just throw a bit of caution to that. That's all I would say.
Mhm. There's a question here, organising to have the cupboard removed and replaced. I wonder if I can recover some of the costs from the tenants who are now leaving the property. They have photographic evidence from the starting inventory and photographs of the current state of the cupboard. So I would say just on the basis of that evidence, it does sound like you would be able to at least claim from the deposit, if there's been some damage to it, depending how
Absolutely.
extreme.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it all comes down to as well, that communication, if it clearly shows that it was, that the hinges were intact and it was, that's where I think your description from your inventory becomes so important. Um,
Mm,
because you can't, you're not necessarily going to take a photo of every door that's shut and open, because you could be there all day. If you've got to balance an efficient use of your time with having a robust report, and you don't want to be, you know, taking 1,000 photos in a two-bed property.
mm. We've got a separate question. The tenants are not letting the landlord inspect, and they've only informed them of damage months after it had occurred. They keep either not being in when workmen are sent, or just refusing flat out to allow the repairs. What sort of things can that landlord do? It is a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah, so I suppose, as far as the fitness for human habitation goes in that respect, if the tenant is refusing access, then, you cannot be held liable for it,
Yeah, yeah.
because that is a basic right of your tenancy agreement, that you have access to the property. And if they're not allowing that, then obviously you need to seek specialist, legal advice, I would say. But, obviously I've only, briefly touched on, I suppose, on the reporting side of it there.
Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky one. It's something we get quite often on the advice team. There's not really a great answer. I mean, you can go down the route of looking at injunctions, but it would probably cost you more than seeking possession, and that's just to allow yourself in for that purpose. Normally, I would just say you'd consider options under Section 8, Section 21, depending how serious this work is and how important it is that it gets done right away. It might be worth seeing if it can be you can hold off on it and try and maybe repair that relationship with the tenant, because otherwise
Yeah.
you're having to look at 6 month notice periods and God knows what else at the moment. So it's not an ideal situation, but it's one that is unfortunately fairly common.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to that thing, doesn't it? Evidence, evidence. Keep records of all your
Certainly.
communications. Before, during, after that. That side of it is obviously really, really important. Even if it's a phone conversation you've had with them, follow it up with an email to say, at 12:30 on such and such a date, we had this conversation. We agreed this.
Mhm.
I would visit on that date. It's all about having records. When things go wrong, that's where your due diligence and your paperwork and record
Yeah,
keeping comes into play, doesn't it?
absolutely. It's becoming more and more important to do that every year as landlords and agents. It's all becoming a game of evidence and proving what you've done in the paper trail.
Yeah.
We've had another question. What would be the best approach if there hasn't been an inventory? So the tenants in this question, they've already been in the property for 5 years, but there is no inventory.
hmm
Is it
Then,
worth doing one now, or starting another tenancy with an inventory, or what would be the approach here?
yeah, because there is nothing to stop you from doing an inventory from that moment in time. Most,
Mm,
providing obviously, I think that would probably be sensible, because obviously, anything that's happened from 0 to 5 years there, you wouldn't have any ability to look at deposit deductions there, because it's the burden of proof sits with the landlord. It's the
mhm,
landlord's responsibility to have that report done, to be able to prove before and after. The only thing I would also caveat on that as well is that, bear in mind that cleanliness, again, you haven't got an inventory, so you couldn't prove the cleanliness. But,
mm,
when you have long tenancies, fair wear and tear is going to come into play. And obviously the lifespan of items before the tenancy started as opposed to the end,
mm.
you would think that any deductions in relation to certain items, that the amount that you would be entitled to deduct reduces. But that
Yeah,
again
it
is where
would.
it comes in. If you replace the oven 3 years in, update that on your inventory. It's about, making sure that all those records are up to date. But actually, you wouldn't be able to claim for anything without having an inventory, because the burden of proof
Mm.
sits with you as a landlord.
So there's a question here. The tenants haven't moved in, have moved in. Sorry, they have moved in, and the inventory report has not yet been completed and sent to them. The agent is blaming COVID. Um, what sort of? I mean, it almost seems a bit not silly, but what can they actually do here? Is if the agent is just going to keep saying, "Oh, we can't because of the coronavirus,"
So
I would say that's an issue with the agent.
yeah, because I mean, that to me sounds like an excuse, because
Hmm.
if the tenant is moving into the property,
Mm,
and there has been a void period, there is nothing. There is, apart from obviously the time when there were restrictions in play,
mm,
but actually, if there's nobody in situ at that property, there's no reason that the agent couldn't have had a report conducted. Now,
Yeah.
if that report wasn't conducted before the tenant moved in, then it's going to be difficult, because performing an inventory when all the tenant's items are inside the property is difficult. Because you're not going to be able to, you're going to have cupboards in place. You can't look behind a cupboard if there's a cupboard there that the tenant's moved in. It's very difficult to create a report or an inventory report after they've moved all their possessions in. So being totally honest, it sounds like a bit of an excuse to me, because maybe they then subsequently go in, but then they've got issues there about obviously getting access and going in and completing an inventory. But the inventory that perhaps they produce is going to be is going to be based upon that moment in time. So if the tenant's been in for a few weeks or a month or 2 months and issues have arisen, then obviously they've got no way of being able to claim against those issues.
Yeah, I think it's worth following up with the agent and see, has the one that's actually been done and it's just a delay of sending them, or has it not been actually done what you've paid the agent to do, and following up with their actual complaints procedure.
Yeah,
It might be a breach of the terms you've got with them. It might be worth exploring which redress scheme they're with and taking it and escalating it. Depends if you're in like a long term with that agent, or if you've only just employed them. It might, play it by ear in that regard.
yeah,
And I think actually we may have to sort of make that our last question. We've done about an hour,
yeah.
so I think that's been really valuable. So apologies we've not got through all the questions, but there was quite a few. We've tried to sort of expand on the topics and try and at least touch on as many things as we can. But I think that's been really interesting, or I found it interesting at least. So one person has, so I'm sure it was really good.
Yeah, my work here is done then, Dan. Yes, that's the case.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for all the questions from everybody that came up on the
Yep, I'll
webinar.
quickly mention, actually, sorry to cut across, just as I've remembered, we do have 2 webinars next week. We've got one on Monday the 14th at 2 p.m. That's with our CEO, Ben Beadle, Funding for Renters, Justice for Landlords. So it's a conversation, and he's talking around sort of the lobbying that we're doing and what we want to see. I won't spoil too much. And then next Wednesday, we've got the buy-to-let mortgage market during COVID-19 and beyond. And that's at 3:15, the usual time. That's next Wednesday. And so that's the buy-to-let mortgage market with the main topic there. So if anyone's interested in those, then you can go and sign up on the website at the moment.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so I'll just say thanks once again to Richard, and thanks you all for coming. And that's all we've got for today.
Thank you all. Thanks, Stacey. Thanks, Dan.
No worries, thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.